All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Malone Smith. I'm the pastor of Community of Hope AME Zion Church in Tallahassee, Florida, and I'm so happy that you're here with me today. First, I want to thank LaKesha and her entire team. This has been a fantastic week. The whole idea of rethinking church and rethinking our audio visual, rethinking how we evangelize, it has just been a power-packed summit. And I've repeatedly told her that, listen, she is on the brink of something very powerful. And I also appreciate them making this last day as we talk about mental health issues, especially in the African-American community, and bringing those to the forefront and having those conversations. So today, I might be the last thing between y'all getting out of here. So I promise I'll keep it interactive. You promise to stay awake and with me, and we'll move through this thing. Amen. 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 So for a moment today, when the bleeding is internal, and we're going to talk about this whole idea of defining internal bleeding. We're going to talk about shadow slavery, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and Dr. Joy DeGruy, and then Black liberation theology, James Cone, and some other things around that. But through it, we'll have question and answer. When we think about bleeding, there is a woman in the 8th chapter of Luke. The woman has experienced all sorts of issues because of her bleeding. 12 years, it says. She had exhausted all of her money, all the doctors, everything to try to solve this bleeding issue. But you guys are all the experts in the Bible, so I don't have to tell you about all the difficulties she faced as a result of this bleeding and being so-called unclean. And so, but to me, from a social justice lens, she represents somebody that's been pushing to the side or pushed to the side. She's bleeding, but she's been forgotten. She's hurt and she's dismissed herself, but she finds the strength to press on and touch the hem of Jesus's garment. Now, this is when everybody starts to shout. You know, she pressed on, she touched him, his virtue flowed out, and I can see all the pastors tuning up, talking about this person, and we can empathize and we can get happy because we can relate to that on some degrees. We've all been cut and bled at times. We have empathy for her. You've had your child come in and scrape their knee, and you tried some mechanical process with a Band-Aid, maybe something topical to rub on top of it to control the bleeding. But if the bleeding was bad enough, you even took that child to the emergency room or yourself to the emergency room to get stitches. But we understand bleeding so well now that you might even have a special surgeon that you need to see when you're bleeding. They may go get a plastic surgeon to keep some things in line as they repair these areas that are bleeding. And so we are much better at handling certain types of bleeding now. I don't know if it means we've gotten better as a society, but it does mean that we've gotten better medically. I'll talk about it a little bit further down. Some of the gains we've made medically have been at the expense of Black people. And so when we look at these abrasions and these tears, we can relate. We can root for this lady because she found her healing. But as we look at this, we've seen doctors and doctors shows, we've seen ER, we've seen Chicago Med, and even the surgeons as they're working, they have problems with internal bleeds. You know, the nurse would say, oh, their blood pressure is falling, and they look for that bleed or that internal bleeding that's deeper down that they don't necessarily see. And so that kind of bleeding to a surgeon can be problematic. But I want you to close your eyes for a moment and think about this. A coworker has returned from their stint as a military policeman in Guantanamo Bay. Oftentimes he's anxious, he's moody. When some of the Indian coworkers come and they're talking in their native tongue, he gets a little jumpy. Despite all of the things we say about we're so proud for your service and we love our veterans, everybody's pushing him off because they don't want to have to supervise him anymore. I contend that that's internal bleeding. That's a hemorrhaging on the inside that he has that we aren't used to dealing with. We like to put a Band-Aid on it. We like to even maybe go get some stitches. But this type of bleeding, when they're hemorrhaging from the inside, is an issue. Continue to close your eyes and continue to walk as we talk about a friend that lost her parents. She lost her mother and she lost her father at different times, but now both parents are gone, alone in the world, have maybe suffered with some behavioral health issues before, and now she's crying out over Facebook, weeping, and people are nervous about how to interact with her. Some don't, some shy away, but she's bleeding all over Facebook and nobody's there to say anything to her. But then you also see the videos when she's at these very high times. And so what we find is we run from that and don't want to engage with that. Brother Carl, I believe that's his name. I don't want to mess it up in the session before this said, or Carrie, just asking somebody, how are you doing? Really, what can I do for you? But we run away from that because, again, even at the church, we'll pay your light bill. We'll help you with utility bills. But when you're having these deep personal bleeds that are impacting you, we don't want to deal with it. Now, to add insult to injury in that case, this person committed suicide. And now the leaders of the church are having problems about even wanting to do the funeral. And so we've got to be very careful at how we look at these things, how we talk to our congregation, how we interact with them, how we show love and show care, and how we avoid issues too. Because sometimes in avoiding these things or half-heartedly performing these funerals for these persons, we show other people that, hey, we really aren't that concerned about you. If we can patch you up, stitch you up, put a Band-Aid on you, that's fine. But when I really have to take the time and invest and listen and then be ready to go on a long-term voyage with you that calls for intervention from professionals and as well as praying for you, that's messy. And we don't find ourselves wanting to get into that. Internal bleeding is messy. Again, I said it's not like rent or utilities. It's time consuming. It requires patience and it requires work. And so as we look at this idea, external bleeding, we got it down. They're about to kick you out of the house. You having problems with your spouse and need somebody to counsel you. You didn't fire from your job. You need some money. We can do the external bleeding thing, but when the bleeding is internal, when one of your congregants and the children just keep having children, but then you find out that there's been abuse, sexual abuse that's been happening for generations in that family, that now it's presenting one way, but it's a result of being abused and manipulated by family members over generations. Are you willing to jump into that fight? You've got a member who's at the top of the world on one day, and at the next day they're down at the bottom of it, and they're dancing all around the sanctuary, and people are telling you to sit them down, and you say no. They found a place and they just need to feel free here. We'll eventually talk, but at first we have to make them feel safe. When the bleeding is internal, it requires a lot more work than just putting a bandage on it. So you may wonder how I got to this place. So Malone Smith, old country boy from Mobile, Alabama, studied at Morehouse College. I got one of my Morehouse brothers in the audience. What's up? Maybe more than that. But I've come out and now I'm working for the state of Florida, and I find myself working as the deputy director for substance abuse and mental health. And I'm also in seminary thinking about what my title should be. And I'm looking around and I wound up going to this facility and I see all these bodies that look like mine. I started to notice behavioral health issues in family and in community, in my own family. And so as a result, I really started thinking about the uncle and soul food that was pushed to the side in the back room. And I was talking to my mentor, Dr. Lester McCoy, said, indeed, this is a social justice issue. So I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a counselor. But what I am is a pastor and a person first that is concerned about people. And so I just want to make sure, check if there are any questions right now, any feedback, any thoughts as we go through this. I'm gonna flip this screen for a second. I'm sorry, just so I can see. All right, indeed, people must feel safe. That's the first thing, making people feel safe, because it's hard to initiate a conversation if people don't feel safe first. And so we go, and a part of looking at this whole idea of mental health, I had to go back to the past and things that impact us. And so I looked at chattel slavery. We've all seen the Project 1619 that just came out, talked about these Africans that came to Jamestown. And then the whole idea of racial slavery was so much, it wasn't new, but it was so much more cruel. And so in order to be as cruel as they were to these beings, they had to see them as not human. They had one Portuguese person saying that they were disfigured people and not see them as human. I talked a bit earlier about medical implications to this whole thing. They even tried to say you had drapetomania or runaway mania if you didn't want to sit there and be a slave. Can you imagine that? That's how medical diagnosis works in concert with political and legal climate. And so you actually decided you were tired of somebody beating you, tired of somebody working you, and tired of somebody taking your children away. And they decided to call you crazy because you got up and left. There are more medical implications. They talked about doctors producing papers saying that blacks were inferior, and so now you've got this being put in research manuals. You've got people that are passionate in law, 3/5 of a person, and then you continue to dehumanize African Americans through things such as the Tuskegee experiment. And Henrietta Lacks, the lady in Baltimore, who they were using her as basically a guinea pig to do studies on. And so the whole idea of slavery also had some medical implications. And so kind of thinking about all this as we think about mental health. And so before we close out on the medical implication part, man, it kind of makes sense then why, somebody would be hesitant to go to the doctor. Or if you're seeing and doctors are reading these things, are they going to be as open to you? So even in going to find your primary healthcare doctor, you need to have a conversation about and try to discern whether they really are there to provide healthcare, or they're there just to see a patient and push you off the door. And so we have to make sure that we're there to advocate for ourselves, to advocate for our loved ones. If you have a person that is going to the hospital and to the doctor, you aren't sure if they fully understand, you need to go. You need to be there and be present so you can advocate for them. Because just because that person's a doctor does not mean that they are looking out for the best interest of your loved one. So there's some medical implications that fed into this. The other thing I looked at was a phenomenon called post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And she uses this term to describe transgenerational adaptations associated with past traumas of slavery and ongoing oppression. And so you would have conversations, and they're probably having some now as a result of everything that's going on in society. Well, that was 400 years ago. You should get over it. You shouldn't be concerned about that. And she opens up the book by telling the story. There's a white mother and there's a black mother. And some of y'all have gotten that speech. I think there's even a of Facebook videos like, we gonna go over, no, they're going over somebody's house and say, don't you touch nothing, don't do this. She think her kids are better. That's a funny one. But also you used to get the speech about, we're going into this store, don't put your hands on nothing you can't afford. Just raise your hand. Just raise your hand if you've gotten that speech, right? But it talks about this white mother, and this child is running all around this bank. I mean, like they own the bank, sitting in the seats, going in everybody's lollipop jar. But the black mother looks at the kid as he starts to take a step and is like, you better not. So just when the black lady goes up to the counter, the child thinks that they have this moment to go explore, and then there's another black mom in the line looking at the child. And so I've talked about this story with some people in my congregation and other people, and some like, well, they just need to be still. But the bigger point she's trying to make is that's the law, that's women protecting their own children and telling them not to go out and explore, don't touch. You can't own this bank. You just have to utilize the bank, but the bank could never be yours. Now, across generations, women had to tell their sons, you know, not to look somebody in the face or don't sass back or whatever, so they could get home. And so generationally, we are impacting our ability to go and be bold and speak out and authentically be ourselves. Dr. Alvin Toussaint describes it as a psychological risk for African Americans that is unknown to white Americans. I'm troubled anytime I see anybody die, and especially black men at the hands of police. But I was really troubled when I saw the brother that was running through Georgia and just went out on a jog. And I'm looking and thinking about my neighborhood. I'm thinking about my son that's going out, who's an avid baseball player, and he's just maybe going on a jog, and all he does is go around the corner. And the fact that this could happen to my child, that white parent isn't even thinking about that. They're thinking about, oh, they're just going around the corner and they'll be right back. Or they're teaching their children how to put it in drive and go down the street, put it in reverse, you know, check all your windows before you take off. And before we even crank the car, we're talking about keeping your hands at 10 and 2 if you get pulled over by the police, you know, not putting your wallet somewhere, all these extra driving instructions that we have. So this post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so in her book, she defines post-traumatic stress disorder and gives these a serious threat or harm to one's life or physical integrity, a threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or a close relative, sudden destruction of one's home or community. Imagine being taken from your homeland and coming over to a strange land, and then having your children taken from you in the second bullet and removed, seeing another person injured or killed as a result of an accident. Maybe somebody sassed off or looked at somebody the wrong way and they got hurt. Learning about a serious threat to a relative or a close friend being kidnapped or tortured. Again, people being separated, a stressor experience with intense fear or terror, the night riders, the Ku Klux Klan, helplessness, being called boy in front of your children and your wife. A stressor or disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is by human design, when there are medical doctors saying that you are inferior, when there are people putting in code and in law that you're 3/5 of a person. And so when we look at that, then coupled with the fact that she says this dysfunctional behaviors and unwanted consequences grow when the injury is repeated, severe, and watch this, caused by humans. And so I apologize for not getting my screens and everything and being able to come through with the technical glitch, but I want to stop here and see if anybody has any comments about this whole idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome. All right. Our people didn't just show up hesitant like we're about getting help. Yeah, accurate. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, could using the N-word as a term of endearment amongst our own people be a type of post-traumatic slave syndrome? You know, that's interesting. Reverend Lamar, hope I got that right. Maybe it's us trying to take some power back over that word. You know, you called us that. You called us that in front of our wives, our husbands, and our children. And now maybe we're trying to take some power back and take the sting out of that word. That's just me kind of thinking about that now, and the whole idea of maybe taking some power back. But there definitely are vestiges of post-traumatic slave syndrome, and we'll segue now into some of those vestiges. And so she defines it mathematically as multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and abuse of opportunity or absence of opportunity to access the benefits available in the society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to access the benefits available in the society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so you have all these things happening multi-generationally. You know, one of the saddest days in my life was when we thought JJ and everybody was going to get out of the ghetto in good times, but then Keith messed around and hurt his leg. And now, you know, all the hopes and dreams and aspirations are gone again. I hope I got some good times, people out there. Hey. And so, and actually that's Dynamite. I'm sorry. I'm over in my other show with Dwayne. But this whole idea of this multi-generational trauma and then the absence of opportunity. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when she talks about these three areas. But feeling like there's something just right across the line that I'm not getting a break. And so when we look at this whole idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome, we get the first thing she calls vacant esteem. And so it believes that one has little or no worth as a result of influences from society, community, and family. And so that's why we have to be careful in looking at the news, or even watching and letting our children watch the news, or getting on Facebook so much, because it will show you subliminal messages that if you are not careful. Remember maybe about a year and a half ago, H&M had the ad, and the black boy had the sweatshirt on, talking he was the coolest monkey in the jungle. But then the white kid had on the sweatshirt that said survivor. Now listen, if anybody is a survivor, it's got to be black folks. And so we have to be careful. Societal influences are found in our institutions, our laws, our policies, and our media. So you've heard it if you have a child that's getting ready to go to college. How many of y'all even experience yourself? You go talk to the counselor and they say, you know what? I think trade school is good for you. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with trade school, but why is it always the first default for our children? Again, there's nothing wrong with it. There are HVAC people, and I recommend all my children. Let me put a pin in that. I recommend for all of my children in the congregation that if you don't want to go get a 4-year degree, these computers will always need to be cooled. Food will always have to stay cool, and you will always need electricity. So you either go be an HVAC person or an electrician, and you're going to be fine. My only point in saying is this: our counselors, through society, through policies, unwritten policies, well, we're going to push all the black kids this way, or what, they're not ready for algebra, they're going to pre-algebra. And so they start right then and there, not allowing our kids to get to areas in education because they've already started routing them in 8th and 9th grade not to be college ready. We see it in our laws when we were seen as 3/5 of a person, and now we've got to go and pass another law to be seen as fully human. And then also that feeling that when one black person messes up, everybody goes, they killed it for everybody, right? And so that's this whole idea of vacant esteem. The second part of post-traumatic syndrome she talks about is ever-present anger. Now, this is interesting. Dr. James R. Samuel said, in its simplest form, anger is the normal emotional response to a blocked goal. Often, if a person's goal remains blocked over time, they will begin to consider the possibility of failure and so experience fear. And when they're fearful, they lash out in anger. So now we look at our young people. We look at our people that have even gone to school and not being able to land that job, people that don't have the resources or the connections or the network. And so now they're angry. They're mad. You know, you don't know what the teacher said to your child at school, but they just seem mad now. All these young men and women that we're trying to work with, they're upset. Tupac talked about it in an interview, and he said it's like being next door, and you know that there's a party next door. There's a buffet line. People are just helping themselves, and it's next door, and you know all you got to do is somebody give you the key so you can get into the party. And so you go and you knock on the door, and nobody wants to let you in. So then the second time you knock a little harder, boom, boom, boom. You know, I think he started saying, you know, we're hungry, please let me in, like a little nursery rhyme. Well, after repeatedly going to the door and you know they're having a good time, you know there's opportunity over there. He said the next thing you know, I'm kicking down the door, blasting. Because I'm angry. I've got these goals. I want to do better, but my school has not helped me in terms of teachers and guidance counselor. Mom and dad were probably hesitant to come up there and challenge. And so now I'm stuck. My uncles are mad and aunts are mad because they're stuck. And so now you have this anger that exists there because you know these things. If somebody just gave you a break, you'd have the opportunity. And so this idea of this ever-present anger that's right below the surface, and that just takes a little bit for you to move and get upset. Then the last part of this is racist socialization. And so, listen, I'm gonna have to go and say it too, because I think sometimes we as the church are guilty of this. You know, we get to places, and I say church, and let me go ahead and just say ministers and stuff, because you know we're seen as the educated. We typically do very well, and we have to make sure that our lens and our eyes don't change, and we don't see ourselves as being up here and not being in and amongst the people that we are ministering to. And so racist socialization occurs when enslaved persons take on the value system of the group enslaving them. Slaves saw the master strong, rich, well-fed, secure, and healthy. Slaves saw themselves as poor, impoverished, insecure, and unhealthy. And so now sometimes we go out and go buy things and do things so we look like we got it going on, and really we don't. But then also from a mindset standpoint, we come and we want to exert, we want to yield power. We don't want to open up our pulpits to women. We think differently about the gays, and we do all these things because we want to see our position is right. And so all of these things impact us when we look at the emotional and behavioral health of our congregations. And so it said any blacks that did not comply with the racist system now of oppression and showed an independent thinking was labeled as belligerent and certainly suffering from mental illness. And so now the last thing you want to be seen as crazy, because the society, larger society, is calling you crazy because you don't want to listen, because you don't want to stay in your place. And so now if you have some genuine behavioral health issues, looking back at the medical implications and how people were possibly and abused in medical situations, looking at the stigma of it, maybe it's hard for you to go engage with somebody to seek behavioral help. There's also another important part of this, and again, I am not a practitioner. Some people say you know enough to be dangerous. I know enough to care. But I know there is a such thing as cultural competence. You need a doctor, again, a primary care doctor that knows and realizes that blood pressure can be different in Black persons, right? Understands that, but also one that's caring enough to maybe point you to some behavioral help. And then when you find that behavioral help, maybe they understand some things about being Black. And if they aren't, they're at least sensitive to that when they start with treatment plans and talk through you with therapy. And so I'm going to pause here again to see if there are any questions or comments in the chat room. Somebody say something. Give me something. Come on, say something. I'll give you a second in the chat room. Any thoughts, comments, rude remarks right now? Jarma says something about invest long term. I'm all right. Maybe when you're talking about invest long term, right, you got to be willing to be with that person and ride them through this storm. It's not an afternoon thunderstorm in Florida, right? This thing is going to take some time. And so, yeah, we have to be invested in them for the long term. And so when I looked at all of this, how can the church become better at shepherding those that are bleeding in the pews? Wow. And, so I think that's a conversation for us because first of all, we have to be open to the problem. We have to be open to it. And then as pastors, we have to realize that now some of us, we are blessed today to have some people that are practitioners and they understand that. And so we're blessed that they are here. But we have to know, first of all, that I don't have that expertise. I can possibly see a couple things, but then start working with you to go get some help. And so, first of all, we have to be willing to accept that and then realize that it's going to be a long-term deal and then become better at it. We have to create networks with behavioral health providers. And so actually, when I did my work, it was talking about helping African Americans get exposure to mental health. One of the biggest things we learned, Cedric, was that we needed to call it behavioral health and stop saying mental health because even that had a stigma. We said it in the session just earlier. It's about how you say things. And so not being so overactive and being patient. I told you, and so I did have a person who came to the church and they were kind of over and around the pews and, just, you knew they were there and other people like, Pastor, you need to sit them down and say, no, time out. Time out. Everybody needs to feel safe here. Over time, the person and I started engaging in conversation. They shared some stuff with me. I said, well, okay, are you being compliant with your medication? I have conversations with my members all the time. I'm talking about compliant with their blood pressure medicine, compliant with the gout medication, everything that they should be taking, but then also talking about their behavioral health prescription. And so, and the person responded back, no. And over time, though, it worked, and the person is now doing well. And so we just have to be patient. We have to realize that as pastors, a lot of us don't have the answers, but just use compassion. Lead with your heart. You see it. You see it and you know something's off. Just lead with your heart and be willing to ask. And then when they respond to you, be willing to help them get help. What about recognizing post-traumatic slave disorder in the diagnostic manual? And so I think that's covered and again, I'm not the practitioner, I just know about it. But if we go back up here and look at it, and it should be covered, right? If these 7 things right here define PTSD according to the DSM, it was the DSM-4 at the time, then look at Black people. Matter of fact, look at our children. We don't even have to go to Chicago. Look to your own neighborhood and just think about this. We might, or just one of these means that you have post-traumatic stress disorder, what I read in the DSM. Don't make me the professional on that, but just one of these. So think about all of these as we were impacted in the middle passage, but how we're still being impacted by these. Think about the fact that my 13-year-old child now is repeatedly looking at CNN and Fox and CBS and NBC and seeing a white man with his knee in my son's neck. You mean to tell me that he doesn't see that as a serious threat or harm to his life or physical integrity? And so we have to look at this and realize that, those stressors are still here. Excuse me as I move through this to get back to my point. Let me check one more time, see if there's anything else out there. Yes. So, all right. Now, as I kept going and kept working, then I looked at the whole idea of Black liberation theology. And you saw maybe on the slides, the past was looking at chattel slavery. Present is all the work. And even in 2015 to now, the research on behavioral health in the African American community and churches get involved has really grown. I have to say that there was not a lot there, but then I'm looking at the future, but I'm going back to this whole idea of liberation theology and Black liberation theology to look at the future and how we need to get involved. And so C.S. Song was discussing liberation theology. He discussed by doing it with your third eye. Have you seen the view of the world from the vantage point of the mentally ill? Have you seen the world from the vantage point of the queer community? Have you seen the world from the vantage point of a woman? And so when we're talking about liberation theology at its essence, we have to be willing to put ourselves and walk in those shoes. And so Cone went on to say the prophets of Israel are prophets of social justice, reminding the people that Yahweh is the author of justice. It is important to note in this connecting that the righteousness of God is not an abstract quantity in the being of God. As with the Greek philosophy, it is rather God's active involvement in history, making right what humans have made wrong. And so society has done all these things. We have to be actively involved in what humans have made wrong. The speaker talked about the whole idea of hope and just hope put things off on somebody else. Delatoro, that hope puts this whole God thing off on somebody else, that we have to get our hands dirty. Cone said that we are the hands of God. But as Black people, we can't truly be liberated until we have liberated and got over our colorism, our sexism, our whole idea with sexual identity and preference, all of those things. But behavioral health and those that are suffering, persons with disabilities, we have to liberate all those that are within our culture in order for us to all truly see liberation. He said the kingdom demands a surrender of one's whole life. How is it possible to be rich seeing others in a state of economic deprivation, at the same time insist that one has complete trust in God? That should bother us. We should want people to do well. Again, how can it be said that Jesus was not primarily a social reformer, but concerned with men's motives and hearts when the kingdom itself strikes across all boundaries? If we're really talking about saving the souls of our congregants and people that are outside of our church, if we're talking about saving souls, period, then we should be nurturing them from a spiritual standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a health standpoint, from a behavioral health standpoint. The whole being, that's true liberation. Think about it, in the midst of COVID, that child that was pushed and not really pushed to get education or a job. So now they're forced to go be an essential worker. And we need them, amen. But wouldn't you like to give your children the choice that they could educate themselves or find jobs or careers or own businesses where they have the choice to go out or not? Society has made it so a lot of us don't have choices. That's true liberation, when you can make financial choices on your own that empower you, spiritual choices that empower you. When we empower these people, it doesn't mean that they have to come join our church. We're just empowering them. That's liberation. It's not about the numbers on the roll. It's not about how the choir sang. It's not about whether your hoop was just right and whether you were in key. This thing means that we have to surrender ourselves to doing the work, to building each segment of our community up. That's when true liberation happens. And so when we put all these things together, and as I was looking at all these things, That's what drove me to this whole idea, is that we have to be present. We have to be present. We have to be compassionate. We have to listen. And so that's a vital part of what we're doing when we're trying to calm people's fears down around seeking help for behavioral health issues. And a big part of it is watching how we preach. We say things like, "Oh, I lost my mind," or "That's just the devil in them." And so now somebody is really struggling in hearing voices, and you're claiming everything is a devil, or you just need to be prayed for, or that's demonic. And now they're not as open to coming to talk to you about these feelings that they have. We're bashing people's sexuality and other things, even if we're doing it on the sly, what we call being funny. And now this child is really struggling with their identity and where they belong in society. And now they can't really talk to you because you cracking jokes out of the pulpit. And so I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but what I am saying is we just have to see with a new set of eyes. Put yourself in the shoes. We all have family members that are struggling with some form of behavioral health, from anxiety issues, depression, all the way through schizophrenia and bipolar. So we just need to be truthful about that. And then secondly, we need to see what we can do to help our own family and then understand it better. And then maybe that will help us be more sensitive as we help those in our congregations. And so I'll pause here also and see if there are any questions or comments. Yeah, I'm gonna watch my mouth. How about that? Our healthcare systems and many of our church systems are broken, but we must first admit to the problems in order to move in the direction of correction and restoration. Yeah, and so Delatorre said the other day he had to convince himself that he is a recovering sexist, a recovering racist, right? And so we have to make sure that we are clear about where we stand and even some issues we may have in where we stand, right? And again, like I say, I'm not a practitioner. I don't have all the answers. But as I looked at this, again, I told you I was working at the state as the deputy director for substance abuse and mental health. I didn't have the programmatic background, but I understand budgets, and we were doing some things in terms of privatizing it through the state. But as I looked around and saw all the people being impacted by it were people of color. They were in this prisons locked away, and there's no other way to say it, like sitting in their own feces and things like that. And I was like, wow, these are Black and brown people. Like, that looks like the dude I went to school with. Like, that could be my cousin. And in one instance, it is my cousin that's sitting in an institution. And so we have to want to face this. We have to want to do something about it, because we all could be facing this one day. Between 18 and 24 is when you see these breaks in these young children that have gone off to college or about to go off to college, and they have these issues. We need to understand mental illness enough to start looking for that around those ages, and then go and get them help so they don't have to suffer. They mentioned in an earlier deal about Kanye West, a brilliant brother. I'm no mental health expert, but there's something there. But somebody's got to take the time and invest and go put their arms around him and say, hey, man, let's talk. Yeah, it could be him, still mourning his mother, but I think there's, maybe a little something more than that. But in all that, it's triggers. But he has to feel safe somewhere in order to be able to land, in order to be able to open up himself. And so what I've done at our church is try to create this safe space so people can talk about what's going on. I am blessed that my wife is a social worker. And so our initial talking to people, I'm not a counselor, our initial just conversations are with her. And then we are starting to have established with what we have here, CBC's community-based care, and they have behavioral health resources there. What I'm most excited though about this is there are professionals that have been listening, and now because everybody is streaming more, maybe we can set up some talks over Zoom where we allow people from the safety of their homes now to have these conversations about what's going on in their lives. Maybe where they just talk about just women's issues and the men get together. We used to meet in a barbershop on Monday nights, and it was Man Monday, and we met at the barbershop because everything was open. That there was no language guardrails. If you needed to talk about it, we talked about it. And so we did that, and the men responded well. And I got ready to do that with the women, and we couldn't quite find somebody to kind of guide. And so now I'm so happy that we've come across all these different persons in this summit to help in this area. And so let me see. Going back to the words we say have weight, yes, and keep people from being open and honest about where they are as well as what they're dealing with. Yeah. And you have to make sure when you're having conversations that you don't close the door for somebody to share something with you or wall yourself out through your conversations, through your words, through all these ways that we can, when you don't want to be bothered with somebody, you can say something and be real short so you don't have to deal with it. And so we have to be careful to make sure that we don't do that. And so now, are there any, we've been talking and there have been some questions, but the future is really in the hands of all of us right now. The future is us making connections with behavioral health care workers and institutions. We had done, at the time I was reaching out to NAMI, they had done some things, but I understand that there might be some better organizations to work with. But the biggest thing is for you as the leader of your church, of your worship experience, of your place of worship, is to go and connect with these resources. So when the persons in your church or even in your community have these issues, you can find somebody. We just recently connected with a nonprofit here, Alliance, that all the other nonprofits work with. And so that way, we're just looking for more resources that we can expose our members to when they need help.